As Dean of the College of Education, I am extremely proud to have instituted this forum series almost 12 years ago. It was developed to address significant educational problems of our day. Diane Horowitz, the director of the series, has presented topics that includes every problem imaginable. We've been fortunate to have guest speakers from within our university, Chicago, and the national arenas, and our audiences have grown with each forum. One of our first presentations was by Karen Lewis, the former president of the Chicago Teachers Union, who passed away this week. Her topic 11 years ago was teaching in tough times. I can only imagine what she might have said about our current tough times. Her staunch advocacy reverberated that evening and affected all present. Her impact continues to have meaning to all of us in Chicago. She will be missed. Tonight, we are honored to have Diane Ravitch share with us her thoughts about the work that the current administration needs to address. I would like you to meet the provost of DePaul, Dr. Salma Ghanem, who will be introducing our esteemed guest. Dr. Ghanem.
Thank you, Paul. Good evening, everybody. And on behalf of DePaul, it is my pleasure to welcome you to the College of Education Winter Forum. Despite the challenges we have all faced and continue to face due to the pandemic, DePaul's commitment to education is really unwavering, and it is manifest in everything that we do, in addition, of course, to hosting this forum. A special thank you to the organizers of this forum, our participants, and of course, a very special thank you to our distinguished guest, Dr. Diane Ravitch, who is honoring us today. DePaul's commitment to education is the foundation on which DePaul University was created. The Vincentians founded DePaul University in 1898, nearly 125 years ago. They created the university initially for the people of Chicago. At the end of the 19th century, great waves of immigration were hitting Chicago. And at that time, there were two major universities in the area, and both of them had enrollment caps, and they only accepted a few of the immigrants each year. But in the late 1800s, roughly 70% of the people in Chicago were immigrants, or they were children of immigrants. Their children are coming of age, and they didn't have a place to send them to school. Enter DePaul. This is the moment the Vincentians founded our university, and they gave it a very specific charter that still reads the same today. It's never changed. It says, among other things, that DePaul will never ask someone their religion as a condition for admission or hiring. From the very beginning, DePaul said, everyone is welcome. Before women could vote, DePaul was the only place in Chicago where they could pursue a career in business or law. DePaul was one of the first schools in Illinois to admit African Americans to its law school. Nearly 125 years after DePaul's founding, our university community is absolutely committed to the Vincentian mission to serve the public good. Our mission is to give people of all ethnicities and backgrounds the opportunity to earn a college education. The commitment to education is not only to serve our DePaul students, but to serve the education of generations to come through the preparation of excellent teachers and administrators who go out and change the world. I'm preaching to the choir, but education is the best way to fight poverty, social injustice, and even death. Studies show that for every year of schooling, lifetime earnings increase by about 10%. Each extra year of a mother's education reduces infant mortality by 5 to 10%. A child with a mother who can read increases the chance of the child more likely to live past their 5th birthday by 50%. Studies show that if all students in low-income countries left school with basic reading skills, 171 million people could be lifted out of poverty. So I applaud all of you for your commitment to education. And once again, welcome to the forum and welcome to DePaul.
Good afternoon and welcome again. Thank you very much, Provost Ghanem and Dean Science, My name is Sonia Soltero. I am the chair of the Department of Leadership, Language, and Curriculum at DePaul University, and I am thrilled to be the moderator tonight for the forum. Before I introduce our distinguished speaker, Dr. Diane Ravitch, participants, just want to tell you that participants in our event can offer comments on the chat function on YouTube. Also, I want to deeply thank the organizers of this event, Dr. Diane Horowitz, who is the coordinator of the College of Education Forum, and Cassidy Bradford, who is the administrative and technical assistant for these forums, who is, without her, we couldn't do anything. We're delighted, truly delighted to have Dr. Diane Ravitch with us today. Dr. Ravitch has a long and distinguished career. She's a research professor of education at New York University and a historian of education. She's the founder and president of the Network of Public Education and the author of over a dozen books and recipient of countless honors and awards, too numerous to mention. She's a graduate of the Houston Public Schools and a passionate advocate of public education. Tonight, she will discuss a new agenda for public schooling, recommendations to the Biden administration. Dr. Ravitch, a warm welcome to the College of Education at DePaul University in Chicago. So I'd like to start off right away with our first question, unless you would like to say a few words before we get started.
Thank you so much. It's really a pleasure to be at DePaul. I believe I spoke at DePaul 10 years ago when my national bestseller came out, The Death and Life of the Great American School System, and had a very warm welcome at that time from students and faculty. And I, before we get started, just wanted to add my condolences to all of Chicago for the loss of Karen Lewis. She is a woman who inspired people across the country, teachers, parents, anyone who cares about the future of education has to learn about the legacy of this wonderful woman. I was very happy to count her as a very dear friend. So it's a terrible loss. And I'm mourned for all of us because she was such an inspirational voice. And fortunately, there are lots of videos of her talking about the importance of education and rallying people to resist against injustice. So let's cherish her legacy.
Yes, thank you so much for those words. We're all mourning her loss, a big loss for us and for the country. So I'd like to begin by asking what is on everybody's mind. The Biden administration wants schools to go back to in-person instruction as soon as possible. But how do we do that safely? What measures and funding have to be in place to do this to happen? And what role should the Department of Education and the federal government play right now?
Well, I think that everyone intuitively has the same answer to the question. We all want children to be back in school. We all want them to have in-person instruction, but we all want it to be done safely. And safely is the key word there. And my personal view is that teachers should be vaccinated before schools are reopened. And given the fact that there are now millions of doses pouring into the cities and states all over the country, I believe that teachers should be prioritized. They are essential workers. And once they have been vaccinated, then in-person instruction will be safe for them and safer for the students. So safe, yes, but safe means room for social distancing, personal protective equipment for everyone, the cleaning equipment that's necessary. I mean, this is a pandemic, and I think that people are very impatient and very eager to get back to normal life. Everyone is. We're sick of being stuck inside and living in our little pods. But it is a pandemic. It's a once in a century event, and so we must be careful because I've read all the different research reports, and they disagree about whether there's another variant that will come out that we're not prepared for. We keep hearing about new variants all the time. So we must proceed with care for the lives of teachers and students and not allow schools to be closed again. I think many of them have been open and closed. Europe was open and we were looking to Europe, then Europe closed again. We've seen communities where they've reopened and then, I mean, this is very hard for everybody, and let's acknowledge that, but also let's recognize that safety first and instruction, in-person instruction follows safety.
Right, and thank you for saying those words. I always try to, and others do as well, as I'm sure you do, to correct people when they say we need to reopen schools. Schools have been opened. It's teachers have been teaching, students have been learning. So it's really about in person, going back to in person rather than using the language of reopening.
Yes, well, I think one thing we've learned from this past year, which has been very hard for parents and very hard for students, and I have grandchildren who are suffering through this, as well as their parents who are suffering through this, is that I think that people have a new appreciation for teachers, and they recognize how hard teachers work, how skillful they are. And I've heard parents say, I can barely manage my 2 children. How do they manage 30? How do they manage 25? How do they manage 30? How do they do it? It seems like magic that teachers can do this day after day. So I think there's a renewed appreciation for the importance of teachers and the importance of in-person instruction. I think that the magic of remote learning has faded a bit as a result of everyone's experience. What can the administration do? Well, they can do what the Trump administration did not do. President Trump and Secretary DeVos last June were urging everyone to get back to school at once, open the schools at once. And they looked at it strictly as an economic decision, that in order to restart the economy, they had to get kids back in school so parents could go back to work. But they weren't willing to put in any money for safety. And of course, that was a non-starter. So this administration, I think, recognizes that the word safety is key in terms of getting everyone back to an in-person instruction. And that they have proposed as part of the coronavirus relief bill that's now under consideration in the Congress, that there will be $170 billion set aside for schools to help them open safely. So let's keep our eye on that. The moderate Republicans came forward with a proposal to cut it to only 20 billion, but that wouldn't go very far considering how many schools we have and how much help is needed to keep children and teachers safe.
Thank you. Can you discuss in some detail the priorities that you and other educators see as critical for the Biden administration to address? And what are the problems that these priorities seek to remedy?
Well, the things that I have been particularly concerned about over this past decade is the rapid advance of privatization. And certainly Betsy DeVos did a lot to push in that direction. She was very disparaging of public schools, and she wanted as much as possible to encourage charter schools, private schools, religious schools. And I'm speaking to a Catholic university, so I'm well aware of I happen to be an appreciator of Catholic education, and I've written many times very positive things about the value of Catholic education. But I am also a very strong supporter of the principle of separation of church and state. And I think that principle is very critical because we have many, many different religions in this country. And as soon as we begin handing out money to religious schools, we will see all kinds of very odd religions coming forward to get public money, which is already happening in states like Florida, where there are religious schools, most of them evangelical schools, that are getting public vouchers, public funding, and they're discriminating. Their websites say you can't come to our school unless you're a member of our faith community. You can't come to school if your parents have a lifestyle that we don't approve of. You can't, they have all kinds of restrictions on, and then many of them are using textbooks that are openly racist or that have their own theological beliefs embedded in them. So I think, to me, being a historian of education and having been on the other side during the 1990s, and it's part of my history that I worked for the first President Bush, and that I was for many years a supporter of charters, and then became very disenchanted as I saw them opening up and taking money away from public schools, and the number of scandals that grew up around charter schools. And the research is now very clear that charters do not get better results than public schools. And the voucher schools, study after study has shown, actually get worse results because so many of them the money being paid for vouchers is less than what public schools get. And so the schools do not have certified teachers, many of them. and they get worse results. The kids actually go backwards if they're in a voucher school. This was found in studies in Ohio, Indiana, Louisiana, the District of Columbia, and other places. So the concern that I have, first of all, is whether we can preserve a public school system, which has been so foundational to the growth of democracy and the protection of democratic ideas in the United States, a common space where communities can get together and people of different backgrounds can exchange ideas and work together. And the other thing, and it's related, is that I have become a very, very strong critic of standardized testing. And I think the two are related because we have seen time and again over the past 20 years, our children mischaracterized, labeled, ranked, and test scores. And I spent 7 years on the National Testing Board, which is called the National Assessment Governing Board. And I'm no fan of standardized tests because I know how error-ridden they are and how it's wrong to label children based on test scores, because children and all people have so many different talents, and test scores give you one kind of a talent, which is the ability to take and do well on a standardized test. But there are lots of other characteristics, abilities, skills, aptitudes that are not measured by standardized tests that are very valuable to the individual and to our society. So those are the two big issues for me right now, are privatization, and it's running up a pace. Almost every red state right now is considering legislation to expand charters and vouchers at the expense of public schools. And the national obsession with standardized test scores.
Thank you. To that point, we have a question from the YouTube chat. Is it likely that the Biden administration will depart from the neoliberal agenda of more charter schools and privatization?
Well, I think that's a very interesting question. And in part, I have to give a wait and see answer. The Secretary of Education designate, Miguel Cardona, is not known for his loyalty or fealty to privatization or to charter schools. He is very much a public school person. He came to the United States from Puerto Rico and had his entire education in public schools, and he understands their value for him as an immigrant and as someone who was growing up in a public housing project. So he's a public school person. On the other hand, he comes from a state where there are only 24 charter schools. And there are other places like California has over 1,000 charter schools. Texas is being bombarded with charters right now. New York has hundreds of charter schools. So Connecticut, in a way, is an outlier in having so few of them. The deputy secretary, Cindy Martin, is the superintendent from San Diego, and she's also very much a public school person. She's had charters in her district in San Diego where she's had to close them down because they were basically not producing anything for the kids, but producing lots of money for the owners. One of the biggest scandals in American history happened to a San Diego-based charter organization, which was an online charter that had ghost students, and they actually stole something like $50 million from the state of California. So she's well aware of the scandals, and she will not be a dupe. On the other hand, what concerns me is that the department right now is being populated by people who are deputy assistant secretaries, the sort of the mid-level staff, which, you know, it matters a lot. And they're not being chosen by the secretary. They're not being chosen by the deputy secretary. I have to say, I don't know who's choosing them. Some of them are from Teach for America. Some of them are from Democrats for Education Reform, which is like the centerpiece of the neoliberal movement, and DFR, as it's called, Democrats for Education Reform. They're Wall Street hedge fund managers, and they are devoted to privatization. They're devoted to Teach for America. They are devoted to high stakes testing, merit pay, everything that I'm critical of, therefore. So there are some DFR people who've been appointed to positions, and there are people that are coming from the Gates Foundation, and the Gates Foundation has not been a reliable ally. And I would say that they've actually, in some ways, been, they've been promoting the high stakes testing and charter agenda. So I'm concerned because the mid-level staff is being appointed, and I don't know who's appointing it, and they're coming from places that will carry forward the neoliberal agenda. Let's see who's going to steer the boat. We don't know that yet, whether it'll be steered from the top or from the bottom.
And we're all keeping an eye on that because there are troubling signs about some of these appointments. Another question about other priorities in the Biden administration related to public funding, racial equity, robust curriculum, and the whole child that you've talked about before.
I think that all of these are interwoven. What I would hope to see from the Biden administration is, first of all, a tremendous emphasis on funding our schools. The one thing that I documented in my last book, Slaying Goliath, because other people documented it before me, was the defunding of public education since 2008. In 2008, we had this recession that was very devastating to the states, as the current pandemic is devastating to the states. And so starting in 2008, many states cut their school budget, and some of them have still not returned to the level where they were financially back in 2008. A few of them have made some gains, but they're still, many of them are still behind where they were 10 years ago. So in the meantime, the student population has grown and the budget has not grown with it. And given the devastating impact of the pandemic, which means a reduction of state revenues, the funding is going to be even more pinched. So I know that President Biden understands the need for increasing the revenues to public schools. I would hope that it would be directed specifically to Title I and to special education and to the students with the greatest needs in the districts who have large concentrations of students with high needs. And I think that will happen, but it will be done with difficulty because there's so much resistance in right now the Congress, as we all know, is so narrowly split, with it being 50-50 in the Senate and almost 50-50 in the House. And every vote's going to be a close one. And one senator, if one Democratic senator defects, that can stymie the whole thing. So I'm hoping that President Biden, given his tremendous legislative skills, will be able to get his budget through and bring fiscal relief to schools across the country, which are hurting.
Thank you. To that question, do you have any priorities regarding the racial equity? And can you offer any specific suggestions about the role of the Department of Education? I don't know if you've heard, in the state of Illinois, there are these curricular relevant standards for teachers, and they're getting quite a lot of pushback, particularly from conservative areas of the state.
Well, I think it's terribly important that we have curriculum that recognizes that we are a diverse country, that we're a multicultural country. Children need to know that they are included and they're participants in American culture and American life, that they in most cases, everyone has made a contribution, and those contributions should be acknowledged. Right now, the battle that I'm increasingly aware of is over something called the 1619 Project. And this was a New York Times special edition, which was looking at American history through a Black lens. And there are many states, particularly in the South, that are considering legislation to ban the use of this, which I think is silly, because I think kids need to be exposed to all kinds of points of view and to debate them. And if you have a different point of view, debate it, but don't ban books. Censorship is the lowest form of discussion. It's saying no discussion at all. There has been a tremendous role in American history for all of our many constituent parts, and they should be part of the curriculum. I'm not entirely comfortable with ethnic studies because I feel that becomes way more divisive than a multicultural curriculum. And I've been involved in both issues in different ways.
Thank you. A question from the chat, Dr. Ravitch, do you foresee any major policy shifts under the Biden administrations with regard to discretionary grants distributed to states, particularly under the CARES Act or coronavirus aid?
Well, I think that the Biden administration will do everything it can to support schools, because the president and his wife, who is an educator, have made a very strong commitment to that. The thing that concerns me about the CARES Act is what happened with the last CARES Act, and that was that The last CARES Act was very stingy towards public schools and very generous towards charter schools, private schools, and religious schools. The last CARES Act had $13 billion for all public schools, which was shared with charter schools. And then it allowed charter schools that then applied to the Paycheck Protection Program, from which they took $1.5 billion. So only 1,000 charter schools got $1.5 billion, whereas every public school in America was shared a pot of $13 billion. It was very disproportionate. There's actually various websites where you can see which schools in your state got the Paycheck Protection Program money. And it's astonishing to see the list, because you'll see that very elite private schools applied for and received anywhere from $7 to $10 million each. Religious schools received $500,000, $1 million, $1.5 million. Meanwhile, the average public school got $134,000. So this is wildly disproportionate, because the public schools have the greatest number of kids who have disabilities and who are English language learners, and they should have gotten more money, not less money. So I think we have to keep an eye on what happens with this CARES package, as to whether, once again, huge amounts of money will be set aside for private schools and charter schools and religious schools. And this is a legacy from Betsy DeVos.
Thank you. Another question from the chat. Is there any concern that some percentage of families who have been educating their children at home due to the pandemic will decide not to return and will homeschool instead?
I think that's a possibility, but I also think it's unlikely. I think that there may be a few families that decide that they really love having their children home all the time. But my guess is that the overwhelming majority of families will be relieved when school is open and their children can go back to real school. And their children will be relieved, because they'll be able to see their friends and play sports and be involved in activities. And if I could judge this by the people I know, they are overwhelmingly eager to see school open again, because their kids are bored with being at home, and it's been very stressful for parents as well. So I don't think there'll be a huge drop off. I know that right now the charter industry and the whole the charter voucher industry is trying to take advantage of the pandemic and to say, well, we're open, come to our school. But there are charters that are closed as well. So I think that's a concern. But I think the larger question of whether parents will simply decide to homeschool, I think that's highly unlikely.
Thank you. Another question. What advice do you have for us faculty in teacher preparation regarding how to regain the ground we've lost in being viewed as relevant and necessary?
Well, I think that you will be more relevant and more necessary, because to begin with, when this pandemic is over, and I pray it's very soon, but let's say that school, the stop-start with school ends in a few months, maybe school resumes for real in September, I hope sooner. We're going to face a situation we've never faced before. The social and emotional problems of children will be intense. The need for counseling and psychologists and for empathy will be intense. And I think that the role of the teacher will be somewhat different. And this is one of the reasons why I very much hope that the states will be able to get waivers from testing this spring. There's a lot of pressure from some of the neoliberal groups to say no waivers for anybody. Everyone has to take tests. And that's another subject I can talk about. But I think that the tests right now are far less important than helping children adjust to transitioning back into the classroom with a sense of things being back to normal, but they are not entirely normal without a lot of support and a lot of help and a lot of opportunity to meet the kids where they are, talk about what they learned, talk about what they did, talk about the things that what happened to them during this past year, and what do they like about being back in school. There are going to be a million things to discuss. And so I think this will put a lot of emphasis on very empathetic teaching and teacher skill and teacher experience. And if anything, I think that teachers will be, right now everyone's scapegoating teachers because they say schools aren't open because teachers are afraid, which is true. Teachers are afraid, they don't want to die. I understand that. But I think that when school resumes, people will be very grateful to have an experienced teacher who can handle a classroom of children and do so in a kind and loving and nurturing and educating way. So I don't think that teachers will be less relevant. I believe they will be more relevant than ever. And I think the big problem that DePaul and other institutions of teacher education will have to figure out is how to meet the need for teachers, because there will be many people who will have left the profession. We see all the time evidence of teacher attrition and teacher shortages and people leaving teaching because they don't want to come back in a pandemic. They have a family member at home with compromising medical conditions and they're afraid to be exposed to children. And so they leave. Now, maybe some of them will come back, maybe not, but I think that we will have a genuine teacher shortage. And that's something that you can deal with. But I think it's also a time to bring pressure to bear on state legislatures to up the salaries of teachers so that teachers know that they're appreciated, not just with an apple on Teacher Appreciation Day, but with a living wage.
Thank you. And related to that, a question, is it anticipated there will be increase in school counseling, social work, and mental health funding to support the second wave of pandemic-related mental health issues? And I'm sure this question is related to students, but as you just mentioned, teachers are leaving the profession partly because of the stressors that they have to endure in dealing with their own families, as well as teaching either hybrid or in person or completely remotely, which creates a lot of stress for teachers as well. So both for teachers and for students.
Well, I understand that the COVID relief bill does have funding for counselors and psychologists and social workers, which I think is all to the good because many schools don't have what they should have in terms of those kind of support services. Teachers need the support. I mean, when the kids and the teachers get back to school, there will have been at least 500,000 deaths, maybe more. Maybe by September, if not sooner, there'll be 600,000 deaths, 700,000 deaths. That means many children will have lost someone that they know, maybe a parent, a sibling, a grandparent, and this, you can't keep life out of the classroom. Children will need support and they'll need to have the assurance that the grown-ups are there to help them. The grown-ups are there to protect them, and the grown-ups are there to steer them as they return to their education. And that education is not just a stressful exercise in academics, but that it's a warm and reassuring place where they're free to experiment and free to learn things that are interesting to them and that are very engaging to them. I think there will be a lot of stress on teachers to adopt a style that is, for want of a better word, sensitive to the needs of children, which goes to the question you raised about child-centered education. And this is a philosophy that says that if you're alienating the children, if you're disciplining them and punishing them, and this is not a child-centered education. This is a tough time. We've all lived through a tough year, and I think it's been especially hard on children because they have not been able to have normal relationships with friends. And I have this hope and expectation that when school reopens, they will all hold and hug each other for days at a time. And frankly, a lot of hugging is needed.
I agree completely. And somewhat related to that, can you speak to the civil rights function of the Department of Education, which was decimated by DeVos? And, yes. And is that going to be reignited, strengthened? What do you think is happening there?
Well, to begin with, as you point out, Betsy DeVos didn't really believe in civil rights enforcement. And so she placed people in charge who didn't believe in it either. And she really hacked away at the Office for Civil Rights. I believe the Biden administration will put very competent people in charge, and they will restore the kinds of protections that had become customary during the Obama administration, where children were protected, whether it was based on race, religion, sexual orientation, whatever you want to call it. There will be protections, and the federal government, I believe, will step in whenever children's rights are violated. And it sends a message. I don't think you have to litigate every single case. When there is a message that the federal government cares and will get involved, then people are much more cautious about how they treat children and how respectful they have to be based on who the students are in front of them.
Thank you. A question, there's so many questions. One about hedge funds. Hedge funds have been involved in early childhood programs across the country, sort of pay for gain type programs. Do you see this gaining momentum soon?
Well, you know, when I wrote my last book, which is called Slaying Goliath, I thought, well, I went through everything that the hedge funds have been behind, as well as the Gates Foundation, the Broad Foundation, Reed Hastings. I mean, I have a whole chapter on who are the people supporting these ideas. And there are a lot of hedge funders there, and also an extraordinary number of billionaires. So when you're fighting for public education and to protect the public interest, you're up against tremendously deep pockets. And what's been very troubling is to see a group like Democrats for Education Reform sending money to politicians as a way of winning them over for their cause. Where this has been particularly problematic is that the Obama administration, which I respected in so many ways, and I voted for him twice and would vote for him a third time if he ran, but their education policies were very much shaped by the Gates Foundation and DFER. And DFER was responsible, I believe, for choosing Arne Duncan. And I don't think that Arne Duncan was particularly successful. I don't think that Race to the Top was successful. Race to the Top to me was an expansion of No Child Left Behind. It really was, and people in Washington referred to the Bush-Obama policy. I mean, between George W. Bush and Barack Obama, the education policy was virtually the same. It was just more punitive under Arne Duncan, which is kind of crazy. So what I've been wishing for, and let me go back to the hedge funders, they seem to be unfazed by failure. And, you know, if you're going to take a business approach to education, which I think in general is a bad idea, but if you're going to take a business approach, at least you shouldn't fund failure. So if you've been pouring money into charter schools and you see that about 30% of them are gone within 5 years, that's not a very good way to spend your money. Why not pour it into public schools where the kids are? It's only after 30 years of investing in charter schools, it's about 6% of kids are in charter schools. We haven't seen any charter miracles, and yet the hedge funders continue to put money into them. And they also get engaged in state and local elections, which is really awful. There's something called the City Fund, which was created a couple of years ago by two billionaires, John Arnold. And John Arnold has made a lot of money at Enron, and another billionaire, Reed Hastings, who owns Netflix. And the two of them started this organization called the City Fund with the goal of sending people into different cities to sway the election towards charter schools and towards the DFER type reforms. And so they started on their first day with $200 million, which is, if you have an organization, I guess that's a good way to start. But they had no members. They just had, a half a dozen staff and $200 million. And they've been very active in intervening in different school board elections. There was just one of the board members in St. Louis recently quit and denounced the City Fund for having gotten involved in the election in St. Louis. But this is happening around the country. They continue to push privatization. They continue to push their neoliberal ideas, and they're not at all dissuaded by having no impact for the good on children. They think if they can create a charter school and it gets good test scores, that they've therefore created a model for the country. And they don't understand that it's not a model if you're selecting your students and you're rejecting the ones you don't want. And after I get off of this Zoom, I'm going to be on a Zoom with Raynard Sanders from New Orleans, who's going to talk about what a hoax the New Orleans story is. And in his book, he argues that all of this money was poured into making New Orleans a showcase, but it's become the highly racially segregated, highly stratified, and that's no model for American education. What our model ought to be is a model of equity. And I'm reminded of something that the great Finnish scholar Pasi Sahlberg said. He said, "We aimed for equity and we got excellence." if you aim for excellence and forget about equity, you'll get a few good schools, a few high performing schools, and you will not get equity. But he said, aim for equity, and excellence is a byproduct, because the boast in Finland is that every school is a good school, and that's what they aim to do.
Can you speak a little more about what's in it for them, for the hedge funders, for the billionaires, for the philanthropists? Why are they doing this?
Well, it's a very good question, and I've asked myself this time and again, because partly I think it's a social thing. They like to go out with their friends and say, well, I'm on the Success Academy board, and the other one says, well, I'm on the Harlem Village Academy board, and I'm on this charter, and I'm on that charter. We're all in this together. It became like a name dropping thing to say which charter board you were on, which charter school you support. I mean, Bruce Rauner in Illinois, your former governor, a big charter supporter. And I once had dinner with him long before he became governor, and he was telling me how wonderful his charter school was. And I said, well, I looked at the data and you don't take in the kids with disabilities. He said, well, why would we want to? And I said, well, they're Americans too. They're children. Why wouldn't you take them? He said, I'm not interested in them. Somebody else can educate them. What about the English learners? You don't have them either. He said, not my problem. Well, that's the attitude of so many people in the charter world, which is, I want the motivated students, I want the high achieving students, and the others can go back to public school. And this is not helping American education. It's like helping the few most successful kids who would be successful in any environment.
Since you mentioned English learners, that's my field, bilingual education. The resistance to bilingual education and native language instruction for all students that should be in the United States to be bilingual and biliterate, it's often, of course, associated with immigration and anti-immigration sentiment. What are your views in relationship to how the Biden administration, I mean, Cardona himself is bilingual, he has a master's degree in bilingual education, but he's also, like you said before, surrounding himself, but there are appointments that are a little troubling that are anti-bilingual education.
Well, I've always believed that everyone should know 2 languages. And if you start with Spanish, you should maintain your Spanish because it's very valuable to have the second language. And then you also must have English, because in this society, you would have problems if you didn't know English. So English should be one of your 2 languages, but 2 languages is good. 3 languages would be even better, but 2 is definitely an asset.
Thank you. There's a question here related to efforts to get rid of Common Core and standardized testing. The Biden administration, if you think there's the will there to do that?
I'm not sure what the Biden administration will do, whether they will or will not have anything to say about Common Core. The federal government is actually prohibited by law from advocating on behalf of any form of curriculum or instruction. They're supposed to fund their programs, but not tell anyone how to teach. And Common Core was not funded by the federal government, although Arne Duncan was a huge advocate for it. It was funded completely by Bill Gates. In my view, it's been a disaster because as I was reading it through, I thought the expectations at different grade levels were completely unrealistic, and that it actually de-emphasized the teaching of literature. The Common Core contains instructions about what percentage of your curriculum should be literature and what percent should be nonfiction or informational text. And there's no basis for that. There's no research that says children will do best or students will do best if 50% of their reading materials is informational. Frankly, you could have 100% of your reading be literature and you wouldn't do any differently than the kid who had 100% informational text. So I think that those decisions about what children should read should be left to teachers. Part of the problem with Common Core is there was an idea behind it, which Bill Gates loved, which was everything should be tied together and standardized. And I heard him give this speech to, it was the National Board for Professional Teaching Standards. And he said, he talked about how we wouldn't have all the wonderful electrical appliances we have if it weren't for the electricity, which is standard everywhere. Well, the problem with that analogy or metaphor is that children are not toasters. So, so his idea was if the standards are the same and the curriculum is the same and the tests are the same and the teacher training is the same and the textbooks are the same and everything is the same, and then all children will come out of the same place. But that doesn't happen, because even in one classroom where everything is exactly the same under one teacher, you still have a range with some kids doing spectacularly well and other kids not doing so well, and everything's the same. So to think that you can apply that to the entire nation and everybody will be lifted up by this wonderful Common Core everything, it's again this idea that standardization would be like plugging in a toaster, and it doesn't work that way. So I think I share the concerns of some of the people. I mean, some of the people are coming from, everyone's coming from a different angle. My big gripe against the Common Core was it was imposed on the states before some of them had even read the standards. And then once it was implemented, it had never been tested. And you cannot implement a vast national change like this without having any field testing whatsoever. If they had tested it, they would have gotten feedback from real teachers, but they never got that.
It was also a money-making enterprise.
Yes, well, it was not a secret. And I said in one of my books, I forget which one, there was a quote from Arne Duncan's chief of staff. She wrote an article in the Harvard Business Review blog, and she said, if you really want to have a national marketplace where businesses can go to scale, then you have to have national standards, national assessments, national teacher training, and then businesses can get into this economic realm and produce for a national market. Right now, the market is too segmented. Well, I think that's a loony idea, of which no real educator, no teacher would agree with. No one wants to be just a cog in somebody else's wheel.
Exactly. A question from the chat. How do you think schools should integrate the lessons of Black Lives Matter and anti-racist movements into curriculum? And what role could and should the Biden administration play in that regard?
And the Biden administration. I think that Black Lives Matter is a very important lesson to be learned. It's not one lesson. It should be integrated as part of education. Anti-racism is crucial in the society because we have been such a racist society. We have had institutionalized racism in our schools and our economy for many, many years. And it's not just a matter of teaching about Black history, but of really having the interaction. And I think that the more that kids interact and the more that there's an racially integrated faculty, and the more that people can talk openly about problems of race, the more openness there'll be. And the more people will understand that we're all people. And I think that anti-racism is not one lesson or a series of lessons, but it should be part of the daily life of the school.
A question about the high stakes and very flawed accountability systems for teachers and teacher evaluations and the high stakes associated with those evaluations. Do you think there will be a movement away from the way we've been doing things that are very punitive?
Well, I don't know whether it will come from the Biden administration. I certainly hope so. I'm very critical of the use of standardized testing, first of all, for students, but secondly, to use the scores of students to evaluate teachers is not just flawed, it's wrong. It's a mistake. In my last book, I absolutely eviscerated the advocacy for value-added measurement or value-added assessment. Basically, since children and students are not randomly distributed, you're judging teachers based on who they teach. So if they're teaching in an affluent suburb, they're very successful because their kids will have high scores. If they're teaching in a very needy school, then it will appear that they're unsuccessful when in fact the tests are reflecting who they're teaching. And I remember when I was at DePaul, you just brought this memory back. A young man came up to me and he said, I've always for years and years wanted to be a first grade teacher. And he said, now I'm afraid that if I go and teach in the kind of school I want to teach in, which is a high needs, high poverty school, my school will be closed because of low scores and I'll be marked as a failure. And, I think it was one of the few times in my life I was speechless because he was right. And I didn't want to say to him, go and teach in Evanston, go teach in New Trier, go teach in an affluent district, and you won't have that problem. Because what he wanted to do was noble, but he was quite right that at that time, with the growing movement towards value-added assessment of teachers, basing teachers' evaluations on test scores, he would have been in a failing school, it would have been closed, and he would have been fired. And I think that this is so wrong, and the research evidence is overwhelming against it. And some states have dropped it, but not all of them. They should all drop it. It's just a very bad practice.
Yes, very much agreed. A question about Chicago. We still don't have an elected school board. Why does representative democracy and democratic control of public schools matter for a school system?
Well, that's a hard question because I live in New York City, and we, like Chicago, do not have an elected school board, but I think we're a harder case than Chicago because Chicago, in a way, seems like a series of villages, and more people seem to know one another. New York is way more anonymous than Chicago is. And everybody I know in Chicago, which may be a very limited set of people, thinks that the city should have an elected school board, and that it gets people engaged in what's happening in their schools. It gives the voice to people who care about what's happening in the schools. And the school board doesn't seem so remote. And in the case of the school board appointed by Rahm Emanuel, it doesn't seem so patrician. And it doesn't seem so elite. It's not people making decisions for other people's children. It's parents and people elected by parents making decisions for people that they know and care about. So I think that it's just a question of people feeling that they have some voice, and under mayoral control, there is no voice.
Let's see. There's a question about in the Biden administration, what policies or changes should be included or addressed in a comprehensive school reform plan?
Oh man, I would think I can give you a wish list, but it doesn't mean it will happen. My wish list would be that there would be, and this is something that Joe Biden said during the campaign, that there would be a federal floor set for teacher salaries, and that teacher salaries wouldn't drop below a certain level. I forget whether he used 50,000 or 60,000, but that would be like a minimum. Whether he can get the funding for that in light of the pandemic and all of the other demands, I'm not sure. But I think that if teachers are not well paid, it's going to be very hard to recruit new teachers. I would like to see an emphasis on class size reduction. And right now in the pandemic relief bill, there actually is money for class size reduction. So that would be very important. I think that we don't spend enough time talking about what works and what works best. And I think most teachers would agree, and most parents would agree, is having smaller classes. And Chicago has had large classes. Los Angeles has very large classes, and teachers want smaller classes, and they should have them. I think that I have to mention something that's very Chicago specific because it goes to this issue. When I was putting together one of the tributes I wrote for Karen Lewis, I got a note from a Chicago lawyer named Matthew Farmer. And Matt Farmer was a very good friend of Karen's. And there's something on Google, which I urge you all to watch. It's Matt Farmer puts Penny Pritzker on trial. It takes place at a CTU meeting of delegates, very large audience. And in the audience is Karen Lewis and Jesse Jackson. And Matt Farmer, who was at that time a public school parent, this was done about 5 years ago, had this mock trial of Penny Pritzker, who's a billionaire in Chicago, and she was on the school board at that time. And so he said, well, let me ask you, Ms. Pritzker, what do you think Chicago children should have? And she said, I think they should have the kind of education that fits them for the workforce, the math and the reading and the science for the workforce. And he said, well, your children go to the University of Chicago Lab School. They have a library. You know how many schools in Chicago don't have a library or a librarian? There are 7 arts teachers at the University of Chicago Lab School. There are many schools in Chicago that don't have an arts teacher. And he went on in this fashion, just chapter and verse about what schools should have. And basically, the needs of the kids in Chicago and the public schools are no different from the needs of the children at the University of Chicago Lab School. And but the money's not there. So I think that what it comes down to is whether we as a society value our children. And it would seem that we don't, not only do we not value our children, we value them if we are wealthy and if we can afford to live in a very affluent district. But if they're in the inner city, if they're in a big urban district like Chicago or Los Angeles or New York, we don't value them so much. And this is just a question of priorities. And it's going to take a lot of pushing on the part of us as citizens to change priorities.
Agreed. And not only do we don't value some children, we also don't value teachers. We have 5 minutes left, and so we'd like to end with the last question. What are the avenues for teachers to have influence over national education policy? How can people on this call keep up with what is happening, and how can they best use their voices and their power?
Well, I would say, first of all, be educated, be informed. I would urge you all to join the Network for Public Education, because we put out, and it doesn't cost anything, we put out an incredible amount of information about high-stakes testing and privatization. I should mention that the one thing President Biden could do would be to eliminate the federal charter schools program, which began in 1994 as a small $4 to $5 million grant program to help mom and pop charters get started. It's now a $440 million a year slush fund, basically for big corporate charters like KIPP and other corporate chains. So President Biden could get rid of that, and that would be a big start. And anything you can do to lend your voices towards that goal would be wonderful. In addition to join the Network for Public Education, read its publications about charters and privatization and vouchers and high-stakes testing. You also could be part of Raise Your Hand in Illinois, which is a powerful group of advocates, and also the Illinois Families for Public Schools, which is now a part of the Network for Public Education. So what I was trying to do in my last book was to spotlight the resistance. And it's very important to be a part of that resistance as teachers, as parents, as people who care about the future of our society. And there's a book I want to recommend that's not a new book, but I think you should all read it, and I could recommend lots more. But it's called The Spirit Level. And it was written by two British sociologists, and they make the point that societies that are more equal are happier. And we have so much inequality in our society that there's a lot of rage, or there's a lot of anger. I watched the impeachment hearings today. This rage and anger in part comes from the fact that we have vast inequities in our society, and we have to heal ourselves. So read The Spirit Level and you'll learn a lot. Also, Richard Rothstein's wonderful book on class and schools, where he absolutely makes the point that you can't expect to get the same academic performance from kids who don't have enough food, who don't have decent medical care, whose mothers don't have prenatal care. He was a big influence on me. So I would be happy to go on with the reading list, but I won't go any farther other than to just say, join the resistance, be part of those who are trying to make change, because we can make change.
Thank you so very much. We have 2 minutes left. Any parting words? I think you just gave us some excellent parting words, but anything else you'd like to finish this excellent, awesome forum?
Well, thank you. I would just say that wherever your path may take you, whether it's to public schools or Catholic schools, treasure your education, keep learning all the time, and don't let anybody slow you down. We can make change. And I think that we've seen just in the last few years, we can change society, but we have to keep changing. We can't let it slow down.
Well, I hope everybody can join me from wherever you are. We have people from Hawaii and from all over the country to please join us. I am thanking Dr. Ravitch for spending this afternoon with us and for a very informative forum. I want to thank Dr. Diane Horowitz and Cassidy Bradford for all their wonderful organizational skills. So thank you again, Dr. Ravitch. It was truly an honor and a pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure to talk to you. Bye-bye.
And again, thank you everybody for joining us. We have attendees, as I said, from around the city, the state, and the country. Should you want more information about DePaul's College of Education, please check out our website. Thank you all for coming, and please look for our spring forum coming in May. And we'll more than likely have the forum in this modality as well. So hopefully we'll have people from around the country again. Thank you again. A real pleasure to have Dr. Diane Ravitch with us tonight. And good night.